questions and we'll start off a conversation, and we have journalist fellows in the room with me who will have questions, and also if anybody on the Zoom call has questions, please type them into the chat function and I will ask them as we go along. We do ask that everyone else mutes their microphone and switches off their camera as well, please. Thank you. Professor Noble, so let me just start with where you began with algorithms of oppression. You started with a simple idea of what happens when you type the term Black women into the internet, and what you found into Google in particular, and what you found was that it was coming up with quite eye-peelingly horrible graphic pornographic imagery. And that's kind of spun on. And what you wrote in your book, which really struck me, is that you spoke about the book. You wanted this to be a practical project, and you wanted it to be a practical project, the goal of which is to eliminate social injustice and change the ways in which people are oppressed with the aid of allegedly neutral technologies. Just start with do you feel you've got there? And if not, why not?
It's always so amazing to me when people read a sentence to me from the book and I'm like, I wrote that. Because, you know, for so many people who write books, you know, it's so difficult. It's such a difficult process and project that you kind of never go back and even break the spine after it comes out. So I will say that, yes, I was really deeply committed and still remain deeply committed to destabilizing the idea that digital technologies and the internet broadly and all of the attendant kind of internet of things that are connected to it are simply neutral tools. And if things go awry, that's strictly a matter of user error, or that, you know, the world got it wrong, or the individual person engaging with the technology got it wrong. I know from my own kind of training in library and information science, which is what I got my PhD in at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that we know that there are these long histories of classification that predate the internet. And of course, search engines being just a huge classification project that actually borrowed many of its logics from the field of library science. Well, we know in other fields outside of kind of the techno-utopian bubble that, you know, classifications and categorizations are deeply political. And that, in fact, I think many of the technologies that we're working with today are about deepening the politics of classification and categorization of people and communities, either into opportunity and possibility or out of the same. And so that was really the reason why I wanted to just take on something that seems so mundane and so everyday, and something that I know that so many people use without any, you know, deep thought. And I wanted to kind of deepen our engagement with that.
Thank you. And do you feel, have you got to where you hoped you'd be 2 years on from the book?
You know, that's a tough question. I mean, I have to say that when I was writing the book, first of all, when I was writing the dissertation, and this for many of the students who are watching, I will say, there was very little agreement in the world about that search engines could be biased. I mean, there were a few reports that had come out about how Google in particular prioritizes its own projects and properties. So, you know, for example, when you're searching for a video online, if you're doing a Google search, you're going to be led to YouTube before Vimeo or anything else. So there was work about that kind of bias that was happening by Google to its own products and projects. And that, of course, was the subject of a Federal Trade Commission inquiry while I was in graduate school. But this idea that all the way down to the level of like the code and the way that AdWords works and the prioritization of kind of racist and sexist logics, that was like pushing a boulder up a mountain to get people to concede that that could happen. I mean, it was hard to find 4 people to be on a dissertation committee, quite frankly, who would put their name behind it. I'm not kidding. So yeah, of course, 2 years after the book has come out, you know, 10 years later from writing the dissertation, it's satisfying to see that now we have whole new fields called AI and ethics at a time when there was no field like that. There were just a few women of color and a few people of color who were writing critically about the internet. There was a long tradition of kind of science and technology studies that was critical of various kinds of technologies. But now I really feel like there's a reckoning that has to happen. It may not be happening as quickly though as I like, but I do feel, you know, this isn't the kind of thing you want to be vindicated about, but I do feel like I thought there was a there, and there's a there, and now many, many people are joining into that conversation.
I mean, it's interesting you use the term reckoning, because this is a term that's being used in journalism a great deal, not least because of a very influential book that came out about journalism's reckoning, which refers to the, you know, the issue of diversity and technology in the newsroom. And I want to come back to journalism as well. But do you get, what would you say the biggest blocks are? Because it strikes me that what the essential argument of your book is that technology is not neutral, and the people who write the code are, you know, bring their own biases in. So what's the solution? Is it about diversity in corporations, or is it about giving people a different, broader education? Is it about moving away from the white male gaze? Where do you think the kind of the start of the solutions would be?
Well, let me make a kind of parallel to journalism. I think that in that field, we certainly have seen the crisis and consequence of not having people of color adequately represented in the newsrooms around the world, and especially not able to articulate and frame the concerns that they report on from the vantage point of the people who, let's say, are being reported about. We know that the same is true in the tech industry, that the lack of diversity, the lack of women, the lack of African Americans, Indigenous people, Latinx, all kinds of communities significantly contributes to a lack of perspective and a lack of point of view that's really important. But I will say that it doesn't just live there, because even if we had the most diverse newsrooms and the most diverse tech companies, we still live in societies that are profoundly structured by inequality, social, political, economic, racial inequality. And those things are not going to just be solved at the level of the employee working in these organizations. What we need, though, are people who are thinking about how their reporting or how their design work is going to intervene upon the inequality. And I think that every industry, quite frankly, and every institution and organization of human life is responsible for contending with that. But of course, you can't do that if you don't have people in positions of authority who have huge impact. I mean, tech workers, what they make affects millions and millions of people around the world. The same that journalists, their voices, they have more voice than others, the way technologists have more voice and more power than others. And so those of us with the power and platforms have to use it in service of, I think, these sets of concerns that I try to raise in the book about deepening structural inequality.
Can I ask you about that issue of deepening structural inequality this year in particular, with COVID-19, something that started as a universal leveler, a disease that hit everyone, including the wealthy and well-traveled, is now in many countries, including yours and mine, deepening existing structural inequalities. And what we particularly found is that the voices of women were left out of the policy debate. The effect that this was having on ethnic minorities was not being kind of considered in the public responses. Do you get the feeling that this year the debate has shifted or gone backwards at all, or do you think we're having these conversations because of the conversations that started before?
Well, you know, I've often said to people, you know, if the future could come back and ask us, you know, one key question, you know, what should it ask us? And, or, you know, what would the answer be to its key question? I often say, you know, you should have listened to women of color. We were trying to tell the world in all of the countries where we live, right? We understand because we are often closest to the crises invoked by lack of care, lack of regard, lack of education, lack of opportunity in the communities, the families and neighborhoods where we live. So for sure, we need to elevate the voices of women of color around the world. And I think that we are we are seeing, I can say in the United States and maybe, you know, more broadly internationally, that the work, for example, that the three women who co-founded Black Lives Matter has done to really impact the policy discussions about policing, about distribution of resources, about justice, about criminal justice systems or injustice systems, depending on how you look at it. So I think we're definitely seeing the elevation of really important voices who are on the front lines of understanding what these crises look like. And of course, again, COVID-19 has created such a disproportionate health impact on communities of color and on poor people, on vulnerable communities. And these are communities of which, you know, women are trying to intervene powerfully at the policy level. I think where we see the disconnect is we can, you know, any of us can just flip on the television and take a look at Congress or take a look at, I don't know, is it the House of Lords or Parliament? Yes, you know, and say, you know, not quite a match to the people who need so desperately to be better represented through public policy.
No, absolutely. And it's kind of extraordinary to see the people that are put up on the public platforms and have no attempt at making this diverse. You mentioned Black Lives Matters, which has been the other big social movement of this year as well as kind of the year before. But what are your thoughts on how it's played out on the platforms? Because this again was another key component of the book, was how it reports on racial politics, especially in the United States. And from what you've seen of the Black Lives Matters movement, how do you think the platforms have done?
Well, this is a complex phenomenon with Black Lives Matter, and you know, that movement is not the specific subject of a lot of my, you know, research. I mean, there are people who are writing whole books about hashtag activism, you know, my colleague Sarah Jackson at Penn. But I will say that, you know, of course, the internet has, you know, I like to think of it in terms of like consequences and affordances. And, you know, how do we think through the complexity of these technologies? Black Lives Matter, of course, being one of the incredible affordances that grew out of kind of organizing online through Twitter and through Facebook in particular. And of course, that has profoundly shaped our understanding of racial justice and educated a lot of people. People have been able to join into the conversation, be politicized in ways that they previously had not been. In much the way, quite frankly, that newspapers worked during the civil rights movement and radio, right, to help us understand what was happening with the civil rights movement. So of course, the platforms have played an important role in amplification. I will say, though, at the same time, that some of the consequences have been the profound dehumanization that happens of Black people in these platforms and through these platforms, who, quite frankly, I believe print trillions of dollars off of the backs of exploited people, where the ability to also organize white supremacists, organize fascist and right-leaning political movements that unfortunately, quite frankly, have more political power in terms of their influence on everything like the White House. I mean, as far up as the White House. So we have to kind of think like, it's not just like the right can organize and we can also organize around racial and economic justice. It's that the true bolstering of power actually has tended to lean much more to the right and to racist organizations and politics and policies. And I think Jesse Daniels' important book, Cyber Racism, really helps us understand architecturally how that's happened in the platforms. So it's been a dangerous trade-off for what we've been able to do to coalesce around Black Lives Matter. We've also, we have more problems to coalesce around that the platforms have also enabled.
As far as you can see, the policy debate around regulation in the United States, but particularly in the European Union, and on regulating the platforms, do you feel that the policymakers at that level are trying to strike the right balance between the right to organize and the right to not be attacked by white supremacists?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, sometimes I watched, you know, these antitrust hearings and all the different kinds of hearings that happen. Like, I mean, like it's a blockbuster movie that's just been released. I mean, it's like such a nerd, and I'll tell you that we are seeing a shift among policymakers who definitely are taking a much more pointed stance, some of them, toward the tech industry. And, we have another hearing coming up in the US on October 28th around antitrust. And the questions are getting harder, and the people that are getting elected are becoming more savvy. And so that's really good because, 4 years ago when these hearings were happening, I mean, you'd see senators do things like, hold up, the joke, this is the meme that was on the internet, was like having a senator hold up a floppy disk and say, is this like Facebook? So, we've come a long way in that regard, but I don't think, the problem is that the tech industry has a huge lobbying control over Congress and governments around the world. And one of the things that, my colleague Sarah Roberts at UCLA has written about is the way in which now the tech industry is writing their own protections into global trade agreements. Now, this is really important because if the sector can go straight to trade agreements to protect their interests and to basically, enact regulation through trade agreements, then it's really, that's in tension with other kinds of regulatory actions that might happen in the EU, the UK, or the US. So I think we've got to really pay attention to the places where they are exerting control. And I don't think that any legislative body really has a full handle on that yet.
No, thank you. Going on from that point about how the media report this, because this is something we've discussed a great deal, and we had a quite lively debate about the social network program as well, and whose voices are showcased. Just tell me what you think about, we're in a room full of journalists, many of whom have reported on tech. If you had a few pieces of advice, I wouldn't say just one, but if you wanted to say something to all the journalists on this call about how the tech industry is reported, what do you want them to, what would you want them to know?
Well, I think that the tech industry, it's really, or the reporting that's happened on the tech industry, especially, of course, I can't help but look to The Guardian and, Olivia Salon and Carol Caldwell, and, people who have broken such important stories that are, that we see in academia as quite crucial to informing the public. And I think that there have been a number of key journalists, I have to say, many of them who are women, LGBTQ journalists, I think Kara Swisher, lots of people who have been foregrounding the most critical and important issues. And, at the same time, I will say I've seen a lot of other journalists, sometimes more junior journalists. Unfortunately, I see a lot of male journalists who go and look for experts to support the stories and only find, people who look like them, even though the people who've really been doing this kind of, I think of like the groundbreaking, very grueling, difficult work of exposing the harms of the tech industry have mostly really been women and mostly been kind of people of color. And again, that our expertise somehow gets, not recognized as even making these stories possible. I find, it's challenging for us as a community of scholars. We talk about these things, or that we're only asked the questions about race, but we actually have, or gender, but we actually have deep expertise about the systems and the political economy and the public policy dimensions of these issues. So I think those are, that's the work we still have to do with journalism schools in training journalists to think about diversity of sources and expertise, but also really trying to get deeper to the origin stories of like, why do we know what we know? Whose voices need to be at the table and amplified? And when we do that, I think what we find is we frame the stories differently. So, the social dilemma, which is what you were just talking about, referencing the Netflix documentary. Of course, I've been in a lot of conversations with people about that, a lot of people hitting me on Twitter about that film. And I've talked to the filmmakers and the producer and who I want to just say for the record are incredibly remorseful that they didn't know about all the women of color who'd been doing the work. I mean, they're very...
But they didn't know. They managed to make an entire documentary without knowing.
They made a huge documentary that is changing, you know, some dimension. I mean, raising a lot of awareness, of course, and they are very surprised, let's say, by some of the feedback that they've gotten on it. But having said that, you know, I think that there's always opportunities to learn. What I always hope for is that, you know, if one film gets made or one story gets written that, let's say, doesn't quite get it right, that's maybe an opening for 50 more stories or 100 more stories, right? There's not just going to be one story. There are many stories. There are many stories of dehumanization that are happening by these technologies, and that humanization has to really be elevated and foregrounded. So there's no shortage of documentaries and stories and films and books that we need to write.
Thank you. I'm going to raise it open to questions now. So do type questions in the box and raise your hand in the room if you've got questions. I'm just going to start with one from Umar Hassan, who's asked a question that kind of relates directly to the title of the seminar. So as a data journalist, how can we address those data biases that often go unseen, and what can be done to address this issue? Is it about looking for new data sets? Is it about looking at them differently?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, the thing you have to remember is that data is a social construction, like so many things that we contend with in the world. Data journalists, you know, or people who really deal with, let's say, large volumes of data, or are using different kinds of computational methods to see different kinds of patterns in order to make sense of what's happening in the world, absolutely need to understand and remember that, especially when we're dealing with large amounts of data, many times data that shows up in kind of these large kind of aggregate pools, sets, is grossly representative. And this is one of the things that I, you know, want to remind us about, like why journalism is so important in kind of, let's say, like in the old school way, is that it was really about storytelling complex ideas. And the thing that big data doesn't do is it doesn't tell complex stories with a close reading, because it's often, again, very grossly, coarsely representative. So we need to remember that about the way in which we're engaging with large data sets. I teach this to my students all the time at UCLA, that, you know, a survey gets you something really different than an interview. And so to what degree can you mitigate and think more complex, or think with multiple methods? I think those are ways to help us, again, uncover the truths that we're trying to tell through research and journalism.
Thank you. Absolutely. It's kind of the idea of going back to storytelling and focusing on individuals, and then fully diverse.
Illuminating. Yeah.
It's really, that's quite cheering to hear as a journalist as well. So, you know, because there's been such a focus on data journalism, but, you know, a reminder that it's used to tell people's stories.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, storytelling, I just cannot, you know, this is one of the things I tried to do in my own book, is tell stories, like open up each chapter with a story so that you can really understand like the texture of a problem. Because one of the things that happens is, especially in the internet space, is we have words and concepts that really flatten very, very important concepts that need to be distinguished. So I'll give you one example, the word content. The word content is really a useless word, because unfortunately it's a word invented by the industry to absolve itself of responsibility for being publishers, okay? That they are not responsible for the content, right? They're just the platform, and that, you know, they're just the dumb pipes, so to speak, because they don't want to be held responsible to Section 230 or to a whole host of other kinds of regulations. But the truth is, a word like content does not disambiguate from evidence-based research, from biography, from banal kinds of information, banal facts that we can all agree upon, to advertising, selling us something, to misinformation or disinformation or propaganda. There's no way to disambiguate when you use a word like content. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we're engaging with the tech industry's words too, and reclaim some of our own words as well, and put those into the mix. And I think that's another thing to think about, because I think journalists working in live institutions and newsrooms are forced to think about their work as content. Content that will go viral, content that will be seen, content that will make a difference for the organizations that you work for. And I think, you know, we can be more thoughtful with what we're talking about when we're talking about a word like that.
That's a really, really good point. Thank you. You know, again, talk about this interface between journalism and tech industry. You know, the tech industry is also one of the biggest funders of journalism in much of the world. And this question from Kirsty Stiles just basically thinks, what do you think about that? In particular, the funding of journalism, jobs and training schemes. So, you know, getting journalists in at a fairly early stage in their career.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these tactics have been ripped out of playbooks of other industries. All right. I want to, you know, remind us that, you know, tobacco industry had teams of scientists who also worked on their payrolls or were funded by them to do research that was favorable to the tobacco industry. So we all have to make decisions, I think, you know, around kind of the integrity of our own work, but we also have to go into these jobs with our eyes wide open. So, you know, I worked in corporate America for 15 years before I became an academic. I think there's a lot of amazing people who work in corporate environments, and those corporate environments are complex and sometimes also predicated on terrible things. So we have to figure out kind of what we're doing. I mean, the real critique that I have of the tech industry funding its own journalism and its own PR people to work on its behalf, I would liken to what tobacco has done in the past and continues to do. But I also think that, you know, the sector has created the conditions for it to be able to come in and rescue journalism. So let me give you an example. Here we are in California. I'm in Los Angeles. I just live down the street from Silicon Beach. And what I see is in California, where Silicon Valley, you know, was born and raised, this industry, for the most part, doesn't pay taxes. So when it doesn't pay taxes and it offshores its profits, then what happens is we have a vacuum. We have an erosion of the democratic institutional counterweights. I would include journalism as part of the institutional counterweight to all kinds of industries, right? And all kinds of other types of corporate control. So we have a weakened K through 12 system, weakened higher education, weakened public media, weakened public health. The conditions are created then for big tech to rush in and bolster journalism, bolster public health, right? Now it's got all the apps for us for contact tracing and otherwise. I mean, we have to actually be suspicious and double click on some of these things and say, wait a minute, let's unpack what's happening here. Maybe if the sector paid taxes into the coffers for the public, of which it extracts all of its profits, we would have the resources we need for independent journalism, independent educational institutions, and so forth. And so these are the kinds of things that I think about, like at the level, again, of the social structure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you a minute to take a sip of water if you need one. Just ask anyone.
Thank you.
Any questions. And if not, I'm going to pounce. Okay. So I'm going to just turn the camera around so you can see Kathy English from Canada. If you just introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm wondering if you had any reaction at all from the tech industry, particularly from, you know, the highest levels to your book, and was there, you know, no, we should sit down and talk about this, we've learned something from you, or did they ignore it, or did they do something worse? Like what, or, you know, what was the reaction, and is it ongoing even?
It's a great question. So I have had contact with many different kinds of people who work at different levels of Google, let's say in particular, also Facebook, and Twitter too. And I would say that most of the people, well, you know, I have a colleague who kind of describes it this way. You know, Facebook might be a kind of company that's like trying to semi-engage with its critics a little bit. Google is all the way NDA'd up, top to bottom. Everyone is under NDA. No one can talk freely if that works at Google. So when I talk to people, you know, I have to be very thoughtful about that engagement, you know, for their protection. And then, you know, Twitter is kind of like more of a don't call me. So, you know, we have these kinds of different cultures. And I think that, you know, there are people who work in engineering jobs that very much follow my work. Now, one of the things that I can do, for example, if I write a paper about Google and I put it in a university repository, I can get a report on a quarterly basis that shows me how many downloads happened by IP address. And I have thousands into Mountain View. So I know that, you know, people are reading. When I talk to people who work at Google, who also share concerns about these, I know, you know, they tell me, I say, like, I know you can't call me because you'll get in trouble. And they're like, don't be crazy, we love you. So there are some people who I think feel like I have said some things that help them then to say some things on the inside because somebody raised those concerns on the outside. So there's always this kind of, I think, symbiotic relationship between people who work in companies or in institutions and people who work outside. The same as academics can respond to and engage with activism in ways that are different than what we can do inside, you know, universities. So I think there's an open secret that we're looking and listening to each other. And I try to, again, I know also that, you know, I have the evidence, for example, my book is like a book of tickets for Google. I mean, they just go page to page and like fix. So I also have the evidence of the things that get fixed and the things that don't, and how that work gets engaged with because of the resolution, so to speak, on a very surface level of some of those problems.
That's brilliant description. What has got fixed and what hasn't got fixed then?
Well, certainly Black girls, when you do the keyword search on Black girls, which gave us all the pornography, that's been fixed. And in true, you know, Google fashion, they have made Black Girls Code, which is one of their community partners that they work with and have provided office space, which is Kimberly Bryant's amazing organization. And, you know, she deserves to be the first hit for sure. So I'm really thrilled that, you know, Google's partnership with them and support of them to be on the first page is there. Other kinds of results, you know, haven't been fixed, like Latina girls, Asian girls. Still, when you look for them, you'll find a lot of pornography and hypersexualized content. And of course, I focus on girls because we know that girls are minors, they're not adults, and we know that the pornography represents adults. So like the women who are agents in those sites are women. So there's always this kind of disconnect in the way that girls get coded, women get coded as girls, and girls get coded out of existence. So, you know, I keep an eye on that, and I get a lot of feedback. 3 Black Teenagers was another example from the book. That was a story broken, in fact, by journalists. So many good stories that journalists pick up, and I know you use social media, and I see the way in which you're kind of, because maybe Twitter is going to break the story first. So going into these places is really helpful and amplifying. And when you do that, industry also responds. And so the better you're reporting on the harms, the more likely they are to also respond and try to fix some of those things.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Hi there, my name's Rebecca Skippage, I work at the BBC. Sorry, I'll chat. It's like a very simple question. Why don't they want to fix this? It seems to me that it is completely clear that it is not okay to put in, Latino girls, and you're immediately sort of set through to porn. Why is there this sense of not wanting to fix what's a systemic injustice, I guess you might call it?
Yeah. You know, I think that some of these systems are really, and I would extend this to Facebook for sure, even to Twitter. The platforms are so large in terms of scale, the speed and scale through which uh, anything can be posted and then disseminated to millions of people instantly in some cases. So, especially in the case of search, you know, more so than even Facebook, because you know, in Twitter, you kind of have to have a campaign to make something explode and be seen, visible, you know, to a lot of people. But in the case of search, you know, it just has to get to the first page. So you know, not only the gamification of the systems that they're built and they can be gamed, and that there are people who spend a lot of money in the advertising mechanism that drives search to own and control certain kinds of keywords. And there are people who have incredible technical prowess that are able to also, you know, exploit metadata in websites and do other kinds of hyperlinking that again makes their content more visible. And, you know, white nationalists and neo-Nazis are particularly excellent at that. So I think if you're talking about an advertising product that is predicated upon making the most money, it means those with the most capital are going to have more power and influence in it, which is the case with the porn industry and other kinds of industries. If you have a system that's predicated upon, again, hyperlinking, good metadata, kind of a technical level of expertise that can enhance visibility, then those with more technical skill. You'd be very surprised to know that the far right is incredibly technically savvy. So, you know, I think this is where, when we put it back into like the frame of democracy and people, this is one of the things I was really trying to pick apart in the book, is that these tools, these platforms, these products are not democratic, because democracy fails as a model when capital and power can kind of control, the same as democracy offline, right? So I think we have to be really, you know, we have to interrogate these systems for what they are, rather than thinking, you know, unfortunately, the question really illuminates how most people think, which is, why can't we fix a broken system and make it democratic? And, you know, that's a question we're asking all over the world about all kinds of systems. Well, we can't, because the systems that are allegedly democratic are rigged for the most powerful. And that's what they're also designed to do. So that means we have a fundamental conflict with what we imagine these projects to be and what they really are.
Thank you. Can I ask, that just goes into the question I've been dying to ask about the Alternative Facebook Oversight Board, which you're a member of.
You almost made me spit my coffee out.
Sorry.
Yes.
How much of this organization do you feel is trying to solve this kind of disconnect between democracy and technology, and what technology, the effects of technology? Or is it more a ticker creating organization, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, the latter. I mean, the real Facebook Oversight Board is what we call ourselves. And we are obviously a long time, that was indeed organized by journalists. So hats off to our friends, our journalist friends on that board. It's designed to illuminate and draw attention to the fact that, one, you know, the fox really cannot guard the hen house. Facebook instituting its own oversight board that has very little power, that has taken 2 years to even get organized and still hasn't really gotten off the ground. I mean, that was supposed to be called into existence to respond to election interference around the world, not just in the United States, in the UK, and all kinds of other places too. And instead, we are 20 days or so away from a US presidential election, and that board still hasn't even met. So it's not playing any kind of active role in adjudicating the harm that it allegedly was going to do. And so, you know, we gathered and decided we'll be the real oversight board to draw attention to the fact that the idea of this oversight board really being viable and making a difference, is probably too limited in scope. Maybe what we really need are some emergency public policies and regulations over a platform that is poised to potentially throw another presidential election in the US and, wreak havoc all over the world. And that's really what we're trying to do. And of course, that board is made up of leading civil rights organizations in the United States, Color of Change, NAACP, Anti-Defamation League, a number of longtime critics who write about the tech industry in the ways that we do. And of course, some of the most important journalists to have broken stories about the harms of the industry as well.
Including Carol Cadwalader, who you raised. Ramisha from Pakistan. I'm just going to turn it around again. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Noble. This is Ramisha from Pakistan. I work in the Urdu service of the Independent UK. And my question to you is, do you think there are biases against other languages as well? Because while I write in Urdu, I'm a bilingual journalist. I can write in English and in Urdu as well. But most of the times what happens is that when I'm writing an article in Urdu and there are things that I need to search, there are things that I need to look around on Google. So I have to, there are some words that I have to find in English and they're just not available in Urdu. Or if you, try to find them in Urdu or any other language, for instance, not just Urdu, it's really hard to find, and the results are not easily available. You just have to, go to several other pages, after that. So do you think there are biases against other languages as well?
Yes, I'm looking up the title of a really important book so that I can give it to you. There was a really important book that I read when I was in grad school. It's kind of roughly called Google and the Global Digital Divide. And it's by Elad Segev, who's an Israeli scholar who wrote this, more than a decade ago. He wrote about the way in which the kind of hegemony of the United States vis-a-vis Google was profoundly impacting kind of global digital divides, because precisely what you're talking about, that other languages that, or let's say English, languages that aren't English and cultures that are not American are subordinated or not as thoroughly engaged with or as deeply engaged as, American culture and American English. And he really carefully traces what that means to export these kinds of technologies all over the world. And of course, many people have written about what this means, kind of exporting this, like American exceptionalism and all the ideologies, because it's not just the tech, it's all the ideologies that are packaged with these technologies that are exported all over the world, and then that create new norms of engagement, of expectation, right? So I think for sure, now, France really took on Google in this respect when the Google Book Digitization Project was underway. And, their huge criticism of that project, that it was in fact like a bastardizing of French culture and the co-optation of French culture into this kind of private American system, and publicly traded, but still. And so I think there have been very good critiques levied about this. And then I'll just add, my colleague, Halcyon Lawrence here in the US, writes extensively about how attendant technologies like voice recognition systems, Siri and Alexa and all of these other kinds of, and like software that's embedded on our phones, doesn't recognize dialects, doesn't recognize basically the way people of color speak. It doesn't recognize African-American vernacular English. We know these things, right? So Caribbean dialects, South Asian dialects. So we know that these are huge problems. And of course, they're all about, again, the kind of predictive normativity around which these systems are built. And this to me is one of the most dangerous dimensions of these technologies is, again, there's always a normative value set or idea or voice or set of words, ways of thinking that set the norm in a technical system, right? It's kind of like you're, you know, every deviation from what is made normative in the system, right, then becomes a problem that can or cannot be contended with easily. And I think when you start talking about the way in which these systems are going to be used and are currently used in, again, predicting our futures, these incredible, egregious dimensions of how these technologies work will come into play. It's very important.
Thank you. Two questions here. Sangmi. Hi.
I actually have similar questions about the language differences.
Yeah.
So I'm a journalist from South Korea.
Hi.
and with the recent rise of worldwide popularity of Korean pop music, and there has been a lot of concerns about how young Asian or Korean women are portrayed, especially on Google search engines, and a lot of Google search research about young Korean female artists or singers are really disturbing and sometimes very hypersexualized from my understanding. And so is there any your suggestion that for journalists in South Korea or maybe non-English speaking countries that how we can take initiative to make our voice heard, to make changes in these kind of content?
How do you get people's attention?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. How do journalists outside the English speaking world get Google's attention for content offensive, basically, about their cultures?
Well, my own experience is that you write the hell and speak the hell out of the problem to the point that it gets their attention publicly, because that's what they tend to respond to. You know, we want to remember that Google has a backlog of, I mean, this is the last time I checked was like 3 years ago. I haven't even checked recently. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of things like, requests for takedown due to the right to be forgotten that have not been attended to. So imagine all the requests that are coming in to do right or fix something that are not fixed, because the scale, again, of the problems far outweighs the human capacity to moderate or manage that content. So what they have typically done is worked in more of a triage mode, which is to figure out what's on fire, what is burning, what has to be tended to, and tend to that. So, this is where journalists amplifying really important harms is very important, because journalists, again, have a very wide platform where they can talk about and make visible the sexualization, for example, of children in search engines and the normalization of that, which of course is partly what we're talking about when we're talking about, the sexualization of Korean girls in search. So I think I find that to be an effective strategy that I see so many people, not just me, doing, which is like raising visibility. And I think that those are important stories to write, and I hope you will write them, because girls deserve to have their identities not fully shaped and formed vis-a-vis social media and search engines and YouTube. And, our ability to intervene there is really, really important. People used to ask me when I first started researching what was happening to Black girls in the same kind of hypersexualized ways. They'd say, well, why don't you go talk to Black girls and see how they feel about it? And I was like, I'm not going to show Black girls that pornography is how they're represented, because if they don't know, they will know and they'll be harmed. Ask any grown woman who lives in any society where women are made sex objects, how awesome it is to try to become a person in those societies. It's really difficult. So, you know, I think we have a lot of research about media representations and what they do to girls' self-esteem, and what they do to also dehumanize girls in a way that makes them more likely victims of harm. So I think this work is really important that you're talking about, and do it every way you can think of to do it, but doing it publicly, I find, is a way to get attention.
Set things on fire so that they'll go out.
Just do journalism. Just do journalism about it, you know?
I mean, I'm going to go to one question from John Norton, who's a professor in Cambridge, who's also...
Oh, I'm so
So
honored.
I have to ask his question here.
Fangirling.
Talking about journalists covering the tech industry, and you were saying that, you know, a lot of the coverage is looking for confirmation of stories they already have. And he's saying, isn't it, to some extent, it's partly a question of diversity, but isn't it also a question of mindset? Because for a long time, he would have described the stance of much journalistic coverage of tech companies as a servile cringe. We saw that in the failure to really investigate corporate tax evasion in Silicon Valley, for example. And do you think that's really changing?
I mean, Professor Naughton is right that the more titillating stories, again, this goes to the ecosystem of how journalism has changed so much by the digital to you know, look for the stories that are going to get 1 million eyeballs. And, you know, it's like me and Professor Naughton and a handful of other people who are really dying to read that tax evasion story. So, you know, everybody else wants to read about, you know, Beyonce. I mean, be real. So this is the challenge, is that journalists are also often, I think, implicated in covering the titillating stories because the corporate advertising model of affecting journalism as an industry also has to do with, you know, these words again, like engagement, another Silicon Valley word that is not helpful, that really you know, flattens our ability to understand whether people are looking at things that will strengthen democracy or things that will numb you out of participating in democracy. That word engagement is a slippery word. So I think we have to, you know, Professor Naughton is right in that we have to storytell better the impact of corporate tax evasion. I mean, that is one of the things I'm also really interested in doing. I mean, we're doing that here at UCLA at our Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, is trying to help people understand what was defunded as a result of that tax evasion, who was harmed, who didn't get medical care, who didn't get an education, who languishes in a job that can't pay the rent because of gentrification. I mean, there are so many stories to help illuminate the truly degrading parts of the industry. And I think that you know, journalists have to get in and figure out how to tell those stories, because those really are the more important stories. I mean, we know a lot about racists on the internet and misogynist trolls on the internet. We really do know a lot about that. Of course, we need to keep talking about that. But what enables that to be so powerful is the fact that the industry as a whole disavows responsibility for it. When they profit off of it, they profit off the virality of misogyny. They profit off of the virality of racism. So those are the stories that we need to be telling to say, like, well, is it actually okay to, you know, make millions of dollars off of an app like WhatsApp that foments genocide? Is it okay? I mean, we're just going to turn a blind eye to that and say companies can do that. You know, those are the rigorous, I think, important stories. And there are many, many, many more that need to be told, and they need to be told for a long time until we either break up these monopolies or some of them become illegal, or some dimensions of their technologies become illegal, or we figure out how to solve the harms that they are contributing to.
Thank you. Thank you for that question as well.
Hi, my name is Jenny Korvasniemi. I work as a journalist in Finland. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask about artificial intelligence because I was thinking about that thing we said earlier about what gets fixed and what doesn't, and why it doesn't get fixed. And Google in particular is relying more and more on artificial intelligence in how it classifies and indexes information. So do you think personally that this is going to pose even more challenges in the future? Because my personal instinct is that if for instance, Google makes, like it has done before, for instance, people have been classified as gorillas and things like that, it is far easy for a tech company to say, okay, this is a machine that did that and not actual people. So how do you feel about this?
Well, you're right. Your instinct is right, and your analysis is right in that, there will be more and more narrow AI is coming, into play every day. And this is kind of, not the AI of science fiction where, machines are humanoid, but I'm talking about this kind of task-driven types of AI that is very much about sorting and classifying and predicting and statistical modeling. And there's more and more of that, and it is becoming more deeply embedded in all kinds of decision making. I mean, obviously, there in the UK, just with the recent algorithmic scoring of students into university or out of university. So we'll see more and more of these kinds of models all over. And I think that they are incredibly opaque. In most cases, they're characterized as trade secrets. So you can't even, in the transparency movement, I mean, this is one of the challenges around the transparency movement is that what companies do is they say, well, if I were to make my proprietary software transparent, I would lose my, my trade secret. So they're able to kind of use these systems, these kind of corporate regimes of property regimes to protect themselves. And indeed, we know already when they fail, when these systems fail, they say, well, it's just the AI. It's just the software that said it. It must be true because it's just math, right? They kind of lean on these just really faulty logics. So I think we have to think about public policy that indeed is going to make people accountable for the products that they make. If you can't explain and you can't fix your AI, it can't come to the marketplace. I mean, I'm always stunned, and I try to say, after I learned about the incredible reporting from Julia Angwin and Jeff Larson and their team at Truth Out about the Compass and the recidivism prediction software failures that were predicting African Americans, I think 4 times more likely to commit a crime than white Americans, and a deeply discriminatory software. Jeff Larson, I was on a panel with him at Stanford, and he was telling the story about it. And he says, we show up at the strip mall where these 3 guys have rented some space and, are making software. And we bring our 15,000 cases of paper and bring it to them to show them the receipts on how their project is, a failure and horrible and really harmful, sentencing people to jail. And I said, I picked up on what he said, and I said, we would never let 3 guys go in a strip mall and cook up some chemicals, roll it out at CVS and Walgreens and Duane Reade and all the, is it Boots? All of the drugstores. And then when it fails and it harms people, people die or people are killed, we say, oh, well, hey, it's just chemistry. I don't even really know, it's our trade secret. We would never allow that. So why do we have these same kinds of logics that apply to the tech industry? We've got to really reimagine profoundly and quickly because of the increased opacity that you're talking about.
Thank you, Professor Noble. That's a perfect note to end a fascinating hour, really, really fascinating. I was making notes all the way through, but the things that struck me from what you talked about really jumped out at me is diversity is vital at every level. If you want things to change, make a noise, as loud a noise as you can. Rethink the word content, rethink the word engagement, be careful about why we use it and in who's interested to use it, and find better ways to tell the story of tax evasion. you know,
And the harms, for sure.
and harms. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for your questions. And it's been a real honor and a real eye-opening seminar. Thank you. And if
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you everyone for dialing in, and a reminder that next we'll go back to our 1 o'clock session because our speakers are in different time zones. But thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your morning.
Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.